Starcraft has the most exciting and compelling history out of any esport. It's been my mission with the Venomous Classic series to document these classic games and give them the due that they deserve, because for many fans, you just start following the game whenever you decide to start playing it, and you miss all of the esports history of the matches that preceded you starting to play the game. Now, there is one specific player, the one we're watching right now, Gregathon, who is my favorite, and basically him going over to Korea and trying to win the GSL was one of the best and most exciting things we had as foreigner fans, non-Koreans. And this was the guy who was best in Brood War, and it looked like the guy who had the best chance out of anyone to win a GSL. Facing off against him, the other non-Korean player who everybody thought had the best chance to win the GSL, Liquid Jinro. I've done an entire hour-long Christmas special on Jinro. I encourage you to check that out after this. But here's what you need to know about Jinro. He's very stylistically similar to IdrA, methodical, macro player, doesn't rely on gimmicks, a guy who did everything he could to try to figure out how to play the proper way. A guy who, as IdrA put it, lost the first two GSL qualifiers trying to figure out how to take his natural base on Steps of War. These guys think about the game the same way. They're both viewed in the Korean community very similarly as guys who are coming over, trying to win a GSL and prove that they can be as good as the Koreans. And Naniwa, who made it all the way to GSL round of 8 about a year later in early 2012, this was in January of 2011, as you see the IdrA hairline on the octopus there. Naniwa said that the Korean pro gamers shared replays before his GSL, like he was practicing and playing custom games with some pro gamers, and they duplicitously went behind his back and gave those replays to the Korean player that he was going to be facing in his round of 8 match, MVP. As you see Jinro there in a leather bracket of his own. The point of me telling that Naniwa story is just to show that there is a sense of tribalism and nationalism amongst the Korean players, where they really don't want a foreigner to win. They don't want a white guy from Sweden or America to come over and raise that GSL trophy. It's never happened. A foreigner has never won a GSL. We've had guys get all the way to the round of 4, Neeb and Jinro. And this was an exciting matchup because IdrA and Jinro were rivals. They were friendly rivals. They didn't dislike each other, and they really respected each other. But in terms of being seen as the top players of their race and the best foreigners, these guys actually played a ton from the beta of Wings of Liberty to mid-2011, around when Jinro retired. These guys played a lot, and after this match, they went on to play this big show match, this online show match, and it was called Clash of the Titans, as we can see them talking to each other a bit there, presumably Artosis in the chat too, and them bantering a bit. But this was a friendly rivalry. Whenever people think of IdrA, they might think, oh, he was a bad manner guy, or hard to get along with in the game, or you had to play a certain way to get him to respect you. IdrA really respected Jinro, and IdrA would say before and after this match that Steps of War was stylistically the perfect map for Jinro as a defensive methodical macro Terran. And if I said Steps of War right then, I meant Jungle Basin. Jungle Basin was the map that IdrA lost on whenever he played Jinro in the round of 32. If you remember the previous episodes of the Gregathon, IdrA's just been cleaning up against top-tier Korean players. The match that he lost was the freaking match against Jinro, which is crazy. So it's really weird to consider that in this god-tier Korean tournament, 2 foreigners make it to the round of 8, which is absolutely crazy to think about, and they have to play each other. Now, if you're sort of sitting to yourself and wondering, man, it sucks that one of these guys had to get eliminated, because obviously, they play each other in a round of 8, only one can advance. Another hilarious fan art there. And it would be cool if we could have a chance to get 2 foreigners in the round of 4. Let me just read off the Korean players who were in the round of 8. Remember, this is 2011 January. LOL at them messing with the settings mid-game. Nestea in his prime, who was like this infallible god tier macro player. Choya, who was like an okay Protoss player. That would probably be the guy that you would want to play. MVP at the peak of his powers, ranked at the top of the ladder and an untouchable monster. He'd be the guy that you would probably want to face least. And then Trickster, who was a top tier macro Protoss, very scary, probably the scariest toss in the whole tournament and in the whole world at the time. IdrA and Jinro, of course. And then the other two guys were Marine King and Nada. And Marine King, aka Foxer, was at the peak of his powers. This was when the maps were still small. It suited his aggressive cheesy style really well. And this was Nada when he was still considered a legend and everyone was still really hyped off of his Brood War rep, and he hadn't like started to decline yet and become disinterested. He was still very scary. So those were the other guys that IdrA and Jinro could have potentially faced. MVP, Trickster, Choya, Nestea, Nada, and Marine King. Now that's scary. You might think about some of these earlier GSLs and be like, oh, TSO Rain, like who was scared of him? Into the Rainbow, like how did he make the finals? Like by this first Code S, this is a scary lineup. I mean, Choya wasn't bad, but the rest of these guys are world beaters. IdrA, Jinro, and Trickster were all top tier from day one of the beta and then a year. Nada, I spoke about him at length in the previous vid, and MKP was a god, so. And this was a real tough time to be a Zerg, remember, too. Alrighty, so if we just want to talk about this game now, I just had to give you a little bit of backstory. It's IdrA versus Jinro, right? Like, there's probably not going to be a cheese. The map pool was a very big deal at the time. When they're playing best of ones, we saw how volatile it was and how IdrA had to make crazy moves and honestly catch some lucky breaks to advance. Well, in this situation, since it's a best of 5 and they're not playing best of ones, winning the maps that are considered like good for Zerg or more balanced is going to be a big deal, as you see Jinro make a few Marines and he's going to start to work out to the tower here for map control. So this is Xel'Naga Caverns. Yes, the natural is very open and it makes Hellions pretty good, but this was definitely considered a map that if you were going to play the Terran in a best of series, you wanted to win. As a little bit of pressure is going to occur here, and this is just classic TVZ of this era where you bring the extra SCV not to do extra damage, but it's a little faster than the Marine, so it can sort of scout ahead, and then if the Zerg is caught off guard, then it can make a bunker, and you're really putting the Zerg in a world of hurt here, and you can put the bunker in weird spots or block people in and do a lot of obnoxious cheesy stuff. And Jinro did this little push to try to poke around and force lings and maybe hit before a spine came up, as it was very popular to make a couple spines on this map to defend against Hellions, as we saw in IdrA vs Clyde. But IdrA's going for a very unorthodox early Roach play. This was a really weird thing that we saw to try to punish aggressive players. Remember, no Ravager, so you're literally just going with Roaches here, and this is when Roaches had like 3 range. So the idea here is like the Terran's going to be doing like a very flimsy opener, maybe even going Hellion because Hellions are so good on this map, is ooh, IdrA barely fails to make it in. If you make it in the base there, it's almost curtains for Terran. But now you can see here IdrA's standing at the freaking building and the Roaches have such shitty range they can't even hit the Marines. This is the sort of thing that Zergs had to deal with at the time that people just forgot about, like the 3-range Roach, the 3-range Queen. We have what should be essentially like a straight build order win for IdrA as a very light, greedy, like 1 Rax Marine expand was attempted, and he walks 5 Roaches to the base of the Terran's ramp when the Terran has 5 Marines and he's not going to do any damage really. Banshee's going to come out and shut this down. And the thing about the Banshee is the Zerg had to have an Evo chamber to make a Spore. So if the Terran player could sneak Banshees, or if they went 2-port and you didn't scout it, if the Banshee showed up in your base and you didn't have Cloak, you were dead a lot of the time. Remember, the Queens did not have as much of a ground range or an anti-air range as they do now. So it's a big deal. You take a unit like the Banshee and it becomes a way more potent harassment tool when the Queen is worse all around, and you want to make less of them because it has less utility. Remember, the Queen being worse has a snowballing effect on every bit of Zerg. If you make less queens, then you have less creep. You have less early and mid-game presence and defensive capability. And you have the ability to die to way more things early on. We look at ZVT now, and a lot of people are sort of upset with how the meta is and how Starcraft watches now. It feels very stale. It feels like it can be nearly impossible to catch a good Korean Zerg off guard early. That's because the Queen's so good. You can make a bunch of queens early, and you're defended. You open 6 Hellions, you run into 5 queens, you know. You open Banshee, they have 4 queens with a lot of range. They can make spores without having an Evo. So you can be very, very safe as Zerg now. Back in the day, it wasn't like this. Zerg was very flimsy. Terran had a lot of options. Terran could keep Zerg on the back foot in a lot of different ways. Terran could play in a macro-focused way that the Zerg had to respect more because the aggressive options were better, as you see Aspire finish for IdrA. It's also worth noting that the Cloak was 200-200 in this era. It was more of a commitment because, like I said, you could just auto GG a Zerg. Zergs at this time, it's not like now where they get an auto 3 bases and they go double Evo early. Zerg in this time was way more flimsy. It was harder to take the natural. It was way, way harder to take a third, especially because of map imbalance. You were looking at situations where you were doing builds like this as Zerg. You were going 2 hatch muta. You were getting out 8 mutas. You were being really vulnerable up until that point, and then once the mutas came out, they allowed you to get map control where you could then go into your third. Now we watch the game and it's like, you start with fucking 14 workers, and you have a third by 3 minutes in. And a lot of people sit there and say, well, it was boring, the wind-up was boring. Well, now you have way less choices in the game. There's way less back and forth. There's less stuff that a player can do early on. That little exchange that we saw with the Marines, as we see IdrA trying to snipe medevacs here, very important to keep the medevac count down when you go for this harassing muta style. Because obviously the Terran player will stem and try to defend, and if you can bait out multiple stems, then you're fighting against Red Marines and you just win. That's one of those old school Brood War interactions that a lot of people don't think about, just because the medevac's so good. Back when you had to use the medic in Star 1, it was a bigger deal of like, oh, he's wasting my medic energy, I need more medics. In this game, once you get a reactor on your starport, man, you just pretty much can't go wrong with making those medevacs. Like, you have 10, like, what's wrong with having 12? Remember, Marine King Prime used to literally make like 22 medevacs in some game, and his bio with really good micro just traded so well. As we see IdrA denying scouting, he does not want the Terran player to know he has a third. He wants the Terran to be really worried about a big Roachling swell flooding in, or him committing really hard to 2-base muta. And IdrA and Jinro going back and forth, and this is what it looks like when 2 players play properly and are both employing a defensive macro style. The sort of exchanges where we saw where IdrA held the first push, but Jinro didn't take unnecessary damage, and then the turrets came up right when the mutas got there. A good sign of a player who's sort of on the ball and has his shit together and knows the timings, especially for stuff like Hellion pushes and mutas, is like your static defense will finish like seconds before the attack hits. You might be saying, well, why not have it earlier? Well, you have to sacrifice other things. Like, if Jinro would have gotten all those turrets 3 minutes earlier, he would have had less Marines. He wouldn't have been able to get upgrades as fast. As you see IdrA screaming in here with Mutaling, Baneling, attacking the tanks first, as Jinro was trying to branch out to this gold third base and set up shop there. As a lot of Marines are left, IdrA will have to turn around, but IdrA did punch out those tanks. Whenever we see this Mutaling, Baneling style, getting rid of the tanks and the Thors is really what you look for. In the Heart of the Swarm and Legacy era, we see the Widow Mine being employed a lot, and the tank having more mobility, and the medevac having more mobility. In this era, it was more about trading and retention, because the mutas didn't regen health either. we've almost gotten to a point in StarCraft 2 Legacy of the Void where everything has gotten so strong where the medevac can always fly away, the mutas regen. It was almost better in many ways in this era where the engagements meant more. As we can see, Mutaling, Baneling surging forward again. That PF has not even been started, as people will literally always make that third a PF. And Jinro is disjointed here, as IdrA has really been in control of the game since the Roach opener, as Marines scream forward there, and they will defend the third. And it looks like Jinro will be able to get the PF up, but he's in this situation where he has to defend his main, his natural, and his third. And he knows IdrA loves to knife in and attack that southern portion of his main, and it makes it way harder to defend that main, because what Jinro really wants is to have all that stuff pushed out at his third, defending that gold base in the middle. But IdrA is a very intelligent player, known for his high APM and incredible macro, so he's not the sort of guy who is just going to slam at the same location over and over. He's already harassed the main multiple times, and whenever you suffer harassment from one spot multiple times, you sort of have to respect it and appreciate that. And that's part of what Jinro was doing by keeping a Thor back and getting the turrets up in the main. That's why we didn't just see his whole army go up to the third, because if we saw the whole army up to the third, IdrA would have saw that and just turned around and knifed into the main. Now we see Jinro combating the open nature of the map by walling off that little left corridor with racks. This was intelligent. We didn't really see players doing like the extended depot walls down to the third until Heart of the Swarm. Players really haven't been using their depots as well as they should ever, truth be told. It's similar to how we saw Protoss players just stop hiding pylons around the map whenever they got nerfed a little bit. It's like, that's still good. As you see, a Thor is coming out. If you don't know, the Thor does splash damage to air units, and it does bonus damage to light units. So it's the counter to mutas. And whenever the Zerg player would go muta, the Terran player would counter by getting a Thor. And once the Thor was out, and especially once you got +1, it was way harder to knife in and do damage with mutas. And it was this sort of dichotomy of the Zerg would build their muta count way up, and then whenever they would try to fight, if the Terran got a lot of Thors, it would be hard, but IdrA's going to attack, and there's only one Thor and 3 tanks, and the macro machine crushing forward here with the plethora of Mutaling, Baneling. And it looks like there's no chance for the Swede. It's 24 mutas are out here flapping wings. And the gold base might survive, but IdrA's just going to go right into the natural. And this is what Jinro was afraid of, and why he kept staggering his units back, and he made that unconventional wall. Is it's not as easy as just having everything push up to your third when your third base is so mid-centric and there's a lot of room on the right side. And Jinro GG's. So that was a classic Greg IdrA Fields game where he defends the initial pressure and stays in the driver's seat with his superior macro. Now, what's interesting to me about that was every game I see IdrA play on Xel'Naga, he goes for a build that uses spine crawlers to be one of the main ways that he defends against Terran. Like in the Clyde game, he expanded and then went double spine, and then when the Marauder Hellion push came, the spines were able to help defend. He had a spine down low by the back path and a spine up top, like classic good tight defense. But that defense doesn't get up until like around when the Hellions arrive. And what Jinro did was say, I know he's expecting Reactor Hellion probably, so I'm going to go like for a delayed Marine push, and if he gets greedy, I might be able to get a bunker up and really fuck him up in terms of messing with his early game plan, and then be able to do another, basically cascade it and take that advantage and use it to parlay it into a mid and late game win. But IdrA open Roach there, completely countered Jinro's build, and even though the Roaches were at a repugnant 3 range and IdrA wasn't able to get much damage done despite like perfectly like knowing the player and knowing the map, he was able to hold out there and accrue an advantage and then crack the middle base. So make sure you sub and hit the bell notification.